I'm a computer scientist, computer architect by training. So this talk will be a tutorial on really the operation of how a neutral atom quantum computers work. We'll start out with a brief introduction to Infleqtion, what we do, the technology we build. You might have already heard a lot of our products and our customers from other talks throughout the last couple of days at Q2B. And then I'll take you through the different operations that we just heard about, how we do readout, we perform gates on our qubits. And then I would also like to take some time to talk about the software layers, how we compile applications to our quantum computer. And then I would love to wrap up touching and digging deeper into fault tolerance and error correction, and really the importance of developing and scaling both hardware and software to this fault tolerant regime. There we go. Cool. To begin with, an overview of Infleqtion. So we design and build neutral atom quantum technologies, really all based around this quantum core, where we can load and trap atoms into this core. We rearrange them into different configurations to provide solutions to different applications. For example, and what I'll be talking about mostly here today, if we arrange them into a lattice, we can use them as a quantum computer that we call scale. We can also use them for different types of quantum sensors. We can turn them into an optical atomic clock called ticker. You can also use them as a quantum radio frequency receiver, shown here by Skywire. This is a really interesting piece of technology, a warm vapor of these neutral atoms. And we can use that to sense electromagnetic signals all the way from kilohertz to terahertz. So that's over 9 orders of magnitude on the EM spectrum, all in a single form factor of this glass cell here that I could hold in my hand. And we also design and develop quantum inertial sensors, and we can use these to sense gravity, to sense acceleration. So you could imagine using these under the water on submersibles or in space to measure the gravity of the Earth. And then finally, near and dear to my heart is the software and applications. None of this would be possible without good software to be as resource efficient as we can be. And we have a product here, SuperStack. This is a cross-layer compiler that we use to run applications on our quantum computer. And like I mentioned, really, if you want to boil it down to its simplest form, what we do is we trap atoms and we manipulate them with lasers. So these two components, the lasers and the neutral atom core, is what allows us to develop this whole host of quantum technologies, all based around the same concept of lasers and atoms. Oh, we're jumping ahead here. There we go. One more. There we go. Before I dig into a lot of the details, I just wanted to linger on these 3 recent results from our team at Infleqtion. If you are interested in learning more about the details of what we do, especially on our compute hardware, please go ahead and check out these papers. They have way more details than I can cover in 20 minutes, especially the first one here on the left. This has a lot of the key details of our hardware. And then the 2 papers on the right detail some of our recent logical qubit experiments, talking about how we encode our physical qubits into a smaller number of higher quality logical qubits, which is a key approach to scaling up towards useful quantum computers. And so to start, let's start with the basics. What are the key components that one would need to build a functioning quantum computer? And if you are an astute observer, you might know that these 5 criteria here are also referred to as DiVincenzo's criteria. And so the key ingredients, minimal ingredients that we need for a quantum computer, we need to have well-defined qubits. For us, that's those hyperfine states of these atoms. In particular, we leverage both cesium and rubidium to do this. We need the ability to initialize the qubit, so we need the ability to reset them to that 0 state before we begin our computation. And then we also need to have sufficient qubit coherence, which is a wonderful property of neutral atom quantum computers. We have qubit coherence times measurable on the order of seconds versus superconducting approaches. This is usually measured in terms of microseconds, milliseconds, that sort of thing. Fourth, we need to have a universal set of gate operations. So we need to have a way to interact with that qubit and have it do our bidding, so to speak. We need a way to program the information that we store on those qubits. With that, we use different pulses of laser light, different sequences of different lasers. I'll go into a little bit more detail in the following slides, but you can think about this as sort of an orchestrating, a musical score to perform our program. And finally, at the end of a computation, we need the ability to measure out the state of these qubits. We can do this by stimulating the atoms, and if they are in the 1 state, they will fluoresce. Our camera will see this. If they're in the 0 state, they will not, and so they will be a dark spot. So we have the ability to distinguish, was this qubit in the state 1 or was it in the state 0? And we need all 5 of these ingredients working together to build a functioning quantum computer. And you might see some diagrams like this in the bottom left-hand corner throughout this talk. This is a quantum circuit. And so when I'm talking about, think about orchestrating a musical score, it very much does look like this. This represents a quantum program where you have time running from left to right, and your qubits are represented by these horizontal wires. And then we have different gate operations that we're going to apply to the qubits throughout the program, very much like playing notes in a musical score. And in the upper right-hand corner, this is a representation of a qubit. It lives on the Bloch sphere. And so we think about the 0 state of the qubit being pointed towards the North Pole and the 1 state of the qubit at the South Pole. And so when you see me talk about different gate operations, I'm really talking about rotating the state of that qubit on this sphere. So to begin with, let's start with the qubits. Nature is quantum. What does that mean? What that really means is that the states of these systems are discrete. They're not continuously indivisible. They have discrete allowed values. And we use this to our advantage if we pick these 2 hyperfine levels of our qubit, or of our atom. We can define those to be the 0 and 1 state of a qubit. Maybe moving. Here we go. This is a nice depiction of a neutral atom quantum computer. We have a lattice of cesium atoms, in this case, trapped in these glass cells. And in between each atom, there's a spacing of about 6 micrometers. So you can imagine, if you've been down and seen our demo at our booth, you have the ability to configure different atoms, make atom art. Come down and check it out if you haven't yet. I highly recommend it. In this case, we need the ability to reset the state of the qubits to 0 or 1 here, represented on the right-hand side, particular energy state of the atoms. And in particular, as I mentioned before, we need to have long coherence times. And so we can measure our T1 times are not even shown here because they're on the order of seconds. We also care about this other measure of coherence, T2 time, and this is on the order of 10 milliseconds. Our second component, we need the ability to read out the state of these qubits. So like I mentioned, we will illuminate the atoms, and if they are in the 1 state, shown here on the right-hand side, this will stimulate a transition to this higher level energy state, and when the state of the electron falls back down, this will emit some light, so these atoms will fluoresce. It will give off light that our camera can detect, and then if we detect a large enough number of photons, we can be very confident that this qubit was in the 1 state. Conversely, if it was in the 0 state, it will not emit those photons. We can be confident that that atom was in the 0 state. We also need the ability to perform gates on our qubits. So here I'm showing Rx, Ry rotations. So if we remember that Bloch sphere that I showed here on the bottom, you could imagine this as rotations around the X and Y axis. So we have the ability to take a qubit that's in the 0 state, for example, pointed at the North Pole, rotated about the X-axis to the 1 state. Now we performed a NOT gate, right? We've taken 0 to 1. If we perform that gate again, we'll take 1 back to 0. The interesting thing about quantum computing is that we could stop halfway through. We could rotate a qubit to the equator, and now it's in this equal superposition of both 0 and 1. We also have the ability to do single-site RZ rotations. This is showing here that we have very fast RZ rotations. Interestingly, there's also the ability to remove all of the RZs from your program. You can take into account these in software. So this is just one example of thinking about how we can use software to make our resources on hardware, minimize those. And then finally, we also need the ability to have qubits talk to one another and entangle their states. To do this, we use simultaneous excitation of two neighboring qubits. So in this case, shown by the purple light here, we have these lasers drive these two qubits simultaneously. It would excite them to the Rydberg state. However, two nearby qubits within their Rydberg radius cannot be simultaneously excited, and so you get this dependent state between the two. Their states are correlated, and in this way we can generate entanglement between those two qubits. I think an interesting aspect of the architecture that we design and build, shown here, is that we have the ability to entangle two particular qubits in place. And to say a bit more about that, I think this connects to this theme of how we use software to make the operation of our hardware more efficient. Atom motion is a very powerful tool, and that's what allows us to rearrange our qubits, achieve that all-to-all connectivity. However, it can be slow. And so thinking about this from a computer science, compiler software perspective, this is a very valuable tool, but it's an expensive one. And so I want to minimize the use of that as much as possible to make my program run as fast as possible. And we achieve this by allowing for in-place entanglement. So we would only move if we need to in order to achieve that universal that all-to-all connectivity, but we don't move more than we need to because we want to minimize runtime. And of course, we have the ability to do atom motion. So this is an example shown here, how we can pick up and move parallel blocks of atoms throughout the circuit, move them to a new location so that they can interact with a new set of neighbors. To say a bit more about how we compile circuits to our quantum computer scale, I already mentioned that one of the things we want to do is minimize the number of movements to cut down on error and runtime. In one of our recent works, so we demonstrated a fault-tolerant implementation of precompiled Shor's algorithm. We also demonstrated, I think, a very interesting feature or capability of quantum circuits and how we compile those. So that's in the middle here, this demonstration of a constant depth CNOT ladder. So a CNOT ladder, you can think about it as a subroutine of many quantum programs. Shows up in applications like Hamiltonian simulation, if you want to simulate the time dynamics of quantum systems. That's a very common subroutine, but it can usually is implemented in linear time. So if I want to entangle n qubits, I need a program that runs for length n. However, what we showed is that there's in fact a very general trade-off that you can make by adding extra qubits and generating entanglement between them. You can execute that subroutine in constant depth. So that's a linear reduction in the case of the CNOT ladder, and this is a very valuable trade-off for something like neutral atoms. So you don't get anything for free, but you have to pay an extra cost in qubits, but you get to reduce your total runtime. And I believe that this is quite a favorable trade-off for a neutral atom architecture where it's relatively easy to scale the number of qubits. And with the last couple slides that I have here, I do want to give you an introduction to fault-tolerant quantum computing. To set the stage of the challenge that we face here, classical transistors have an error rate, barely even measurable, almost 10 to the minus 12. On the other hand, qubits have an error rate orders of magnitude larger, right? So we hear about fidelities of 99.9% or so. That's orders of magnitude noisier than transistors. So how do we expect to scale up these quantum computers to meaningfully large sizes so that they can run useful applications? Well, we need what's called error correction. At a high level, if you look at the plot on the right-hand side, this shows where actually, this is from my PhD thesis. It's maybe a few years old now. I could update, where that orange curve is. We've made a lot of progress in the last 2 years. But it shows that there still exists this resource gap between the devices that we have available today and the applications that we want to run in the future. So how do we cross this gap? Well, we can make a trade-off. We can make a deal. We can vastly increase the size of our systems. We can use many more physical qubits to then form a smaller number of higher quality logical qubits. The way that we do this is we encode our information into a code. So for example, the notation here is shown here for this 422 code. So this shows the number of physical qubits, 4 qubits, are used to encode 2 logical qubits at a distance of 2. What that means is that it would take 2 errors to flip you from one logical state to the other. And so in fact, this code, you can correct, D over 2 floor. So in this case, this is only an error detecting code. We don't have the ability to correct, but if we are at distance 3, a distance 3 code has the ability to correct 1 error, and so on. If we scale up the distance of our code, we use more physical qubits to encode our logical qubits, we can correct a larger and larger number of errors. And that means that we can run longer and longer computations. I think the point to make here, so I've listed some logical operations, some code words, stabilizers. These might be words that you'll hear when you're starting to think about fault tolerance and error correction. This is something that we think a lot about in the software and in the compiler stack. How can we translate a user's program into a logical representation and then use a physical hardware implementation to satisfy those logical requirements? And the point to make is that we have the ability to translate physical operations into logical program operations. This is just a fun example here of what this might look like. So this is the same circuit. The unencoded circuit is shown on the top, and then 2 different ways to encode that same logical circuit are shown on the bottom, and then accompanying that is the sequence of gates and movements that would be needed to implement this fault-tolerantly encoded operation. So it looks like we're adding a whole bunch of extra steps and gates, but this is worthwhile because it drastically reduces the error rate and allows us to execute longer, more useful programs. And finally, I have one more slide for you here, thinking about the future. There we go. Thinking about the future, about how we're going to scale up, Infleqtion's approach is to use this dual species architecture. On the left-hand side, this is showing recent work from our chief scientist, Professor Mark Safman at the University of Madison, Wisconsin, where he's demonstrated the ability to simultaneously trap cesium atoms and rubidium atoms in the same optical lattice. Why is this useful? It's useful because I showed you all those laser lights that interact with the qubits. The 2 species are essentially blind to each other's optical transitions. What this means is that we can use one species as data, the other species as ancilla. We can use the ancilla to measure errors and read those out without disturbing the state of the data qubits. And so on the right-hand side, this is some recent, very interesting work that I think shows a very interesting and compelling path towards compiling to these dual species architectures and the advantages that will have. So with that, thank you very much and happy to take any questions.